reminder that the term test is coming soon. I think this year I will post 16 as opposed to 20 questions. So again, I apologize if there's a lot of stuff to learn by heart in this class. The really interesting stuff begins after the term test, but we need first to cover the concept. So I'll do my best to post them tomorrow at the latest. If you want to talk to me, I'm out of town for pretty much the rest of the week, but I'll try to answer my emails. But to be honest, though, I mean, most of the questions are pretty straightforward. They're again based on the textbook, the videos, and things that are mentioned in class. So it's a combination of the three, and you can expect 10 questions worth 20% of your final mark. Again, no surprises. Don't try to think that there's a trick when I ask you questions. If I ask you a question, if I ask you how do the authors define something, I honestly only want the definition in the textbook. And again, these are things that you need to memorize, but they're concept and there's no way out of them. We can't have a productive discussion of industries if you don't know the concepts that we'll be talking about. Okay, if you came in late, stay put and pick up your assignment at the end of the lecture. Okay, the lecture today is about labor, especially unions. I have once again some disagreements with the authors, but what I will do is show you a few videos that will either support what the authors are saying or presenting a different perspective. And once again, you can expect a question on this material, but I will tell you what matters as far as the videos are concerned. Okay, that's pretty much the best I can do, I'm afraid. So, what are the objectives of the chapter? Well, so far the authors have introduced you to some basic concept in economic geography. They've talked about business, but they come from an age and a perspective in which, to be honest, labor unions were more important than they were today. Now, if I may ask, how many of you have ever belonged to a union? Seriously? 1, 2, 3? Okay. Well, chances are, with the way the labor market is going, unless you work for the government, an educational institution, or some sort of similar organizations, most of you are probably more likely to be self-employed or to be non-unionized than being unionized. But still, unions play a significant role in our society. They're especially still important in the context of government, and to a lesser extent than in the past in the world of large businesses. So they're obviously worth discussing. So the approach of the authors is at first really a-geographical or a-spatial to introduce you to what unions are, but then the geography steps in and it's really about particular conditions in particular locations. And they engage to some extent into some sort of comparative analysis, saying that some countries have more detailed and more strict labor regulations than others. Where the authors and I might disagree is to the benefits and consequences of different institutional arrangements. So what they aim to do is to explore the employment relationship between workers and employers, especially again in the context of a unionized firm. Firms discuss labor segmentation over time, tell you that things have changed. I mean, a few decades ago you had a number of people who worked for large firms and were unionized, much less so today. And the way they describe that is to talk about a shift from Fordism, where you were working, for example, on an assembly line for a very large firm, to a world in which flexible labor market, where you have a lot more self-employed people or part-time workers, are now present, and their geographical implications. They also discuss to some extent geographical mobility of people, so both within countries and between countries, or even between, let's say, city regions and the core of the cities, and then how people tend to migrate back to the suburbs as they get older. Okay, so a few definitions. They discuss the labor as a countervailing power. Again, they come from a tradition, institutionalism, that used to emphasize large firms and the power that these firms once had. And they argued, well, it's like everything in life, there's a yin, there's a yang, there's something that pushes, there's something that pushes back. In the context of labor markets, well, you had the managers of the large firms on the one hand, and then you had large unions who negotiated collective agreements for their workers on others. And these interactions were mediated by government, so people who made broad rules and who would enforce agreements. Now, the way they go about this is to describe labor as a fictitious commodity, and their argument for that is that individuals are not created for sale in markets. Yes, we're not created for sales in markets. I mean, our ancestors used to roam the savannah in Africa a long time ago, but I think it's fair to say that in a modern economy, we all are to some extent commodities, in the sense that if we want to be gainfully employed, well, we need to acquire some skills, and we're typically paid, or we get the kind of job that we do based on the skills that we've acquired, either as young kids learning to read, write, and do basic arithmetics, or much more specialized skills as we get older. And the level of skills that any individual has, obviously, is the most important factor in determining the worth of that individual in a market. So, is that a fictitious commodity? I would argue that it's kind of pretty real. I mean, your skill level, what you have to offer, your personality, the fact that you're outgoing, or the fact that you're willing to put up with difficult working conditions, are all things that are valued in markets. And ultimately, the arbitrage of supply and demand will determine to the largest extent the amount of work, the amount of pay that you get for doing a particular type of work. Now, obviously, people have ideas and skills, but also habits and disciplines. I mean, are you willing to work the night shift? If you want to be a trucker, are you willing to cross the United States on a regular basis, or don't you want to see your kids every day? Are you willing to work difficult jobs in remote regions? Do you want to stay close to your family? And are you then limited in terms of the job opportunities that you're being offered? All those things do matter on top of the skills that you acquire. And most of these other factors, as you might have noticed in the list that I just gave you, tend to be geographical in nature. So either you commute long distances, or you're willing to go work in particular locations that offer more interesting opportunities than others, or at least more interesting opportunities to you. Now, people can obviously negotiate their labor with their employers on their own, but for a very long time you have had organizations that engage in collective bargaining, meaning that some people represent the demands and negotiate the conditions for most workers in a firm or in a branch of government, or something along those lines. And these organizations are known as unions. Now, other factors that matter in terms of labor, as I was telling you, how much or how willing are you to move from where your family is, or the type of amenities that a particular location offer, or a particular climate. And over time, what kind of market segment will you come to occupy? Will you get the kind of job where you know exactly how many days you have until you retire, or are you self-employed and you constantly have to create a demand for your skills? Okay, so in terms of agreement between employers and employees, obviously you need to negotiate your wage, your working conditions, the type of additional benefits that you will get or not. And what the authors point out is that there's quite a range of negotiations between firms and between people. Do you insist on being self-employed? Are you willing to work 2 weeks, come at a high wage, then take 2 weeks off? But then the trade-off is that you need to go hustle for another job on your own. or do you value security, a structured organization around you, and are you willing to give up ways to express your creativity in doing something like that? Now, what the authors point out, and this is obviously true, structured labor markets are most evident where strong regulations can be enforced and there is collective bargaining. Now, Canada in general tends to be pro-union, at least the provinces, which typically regulate those conditions. I come from a province, Quebec, which is probably the most union-friendly in North America. But then you go to many states in the United States, and the legislation was designed to give more power to firms as opposed to unions. The idea here being that the more flexibility firms have, the more they will tend to hire, as opposed to being essentially tied up in negotiating union agreements. But ultimately, whatever the conditions are, whatever the regulations are, wages are determined by the need that firms have to employ people and the skills and other characteristics or other qualities that people have to offer to firms. And so I guess all of us, well, I assume that most of you never had a full-time wage, a full-time job at this point in your life. It might be that you think that you're entitled to earn $100,000 when you hit the job market. Unfortunately, unless you have a strong skill set, this is unlikely to be the case. Now, again, it's not because people are necessarily evil, but you must always remember that firms are ultimately answerable to consumers, and that if they start paying people to an extent to which they become unprofitable, then obviously nobody benefits in the long run. So firms have obviously a few objectives that they have, which is typically to pay people as little as possible. Individuals obviously have the objective of getting paid as much as they can, or else get some other trade-off, be it flexibility or something else. And at some point in a normal labor market, supply meets demand and a wage is agreed upon if you're looking for a job and are willing to work. Okay, so in that context, labor unions represent workers in collective bargaining. Again, collective bargaining, not individual bargaining. So again, if you're self-employed and you want to work for a firm or work for consultants or for other people, you typically have to negotiate your own wage, your own conditions. But for most large firms, historically what evolved was collective bargaining. On the one hand, firms can have a sense of what their labor costs will be. There is some certainty in the process, and unions are obviously in the business of negotiating the best deal for their employees, be it in terms of pay and non-wage benefits. Now, unions were traditionally organized workers in similar occupations of industry, so you know the brotherhood of pipe fitters, electricians. But when large firms emerged, unions began to appear that were limited at first to the workers within that firm, although obviously those unions would eventually come to merge with other unions or join an existing structure beyond the walls of the firms. Now, the heydays of unionization in North America were really, let's say, the 3 decades that followed the Second World War. And since the recession of the early 1980s, the percentage of people who belong to a union has gone down dramatically, especially in the private sector in most advanced economies. Now, you can expect a question on this. I can tell you right now that I will ask you to define the employment relationship, which is the definition that you will find in the textbook. And then I will ask you to illustrate it, and that's really what I want. So the employment relationship is characterized by both mutual antagonism and mutual interdependence. Again, firms want to pay people as little as possible and have them work as long hours as possible. People typically want to be paid more, work less. But there cannot be a firm without workers, and there cannot be workers without a firm, so they've got to get along somehow. So in terms of the things that they will disagree over, and in some cases perhaps fight bitterly, is control over production processes, so the specific tasks that people must do, the speed at which they must do them, and the way the work is structured within the firm. And obviously also the conditions of employment, so the hours worked, the wages, the benefits. And then you've got government regulations that help determine, or at least provide a framework around which these things are negotiated. And you can have union contracts within firms or particular occupations, or you can also have non-union contracts. A lot of workers in firms are not unionized, and then arrangements will be reached through some other ways, typically involving the worker directly as opposed to a union. But then again, while there is much antagonism, ultimately workers and firms have to perform on a market compared to other firms and other workers, and so there is also, to a large extent, some mutual interdependence and a commonality of interest in terms of having the business thrive and being competitive. Because if a business goes bankrupt, obviously everybody loses, both the managers, the owners, and the workers. Okay, so figure 5.2. Now, in terms of government policies and unions, these negotiations take place within the general framework provided by government laws. Again, some jurisdictions are more pro-unions than others, but typically labor laws affect all workers, whether they're unionized or not. Like, for example, we have a minimum wage in this province. You can always, work under the table, or you might have a profession, like, you can be a waiter, a waitress, or you can go pick berries, which are typically, historically at least, occupations in which, in many Canadian provinces, you don't have formal minimum wages, but you can have laws that affect everyone, and the minimum wage law is one of those. So the authors tend to be very pro-minimum wage laws, but there is a standard economic critique, which I suspect many of you will not really appreciate, but I thought in the context of this course, it was important that you hear it if you're not an economics major. So, hoping that everything works.
The truth about the minimum wage.
So again, these are people.
The minimum wage is supposed to help the poorer, less skilled, and younger workers in the economy, but it doesn't. It gets them fired. Employment happens as a result of human choices. For example, let's say some kid named Jimmy knocks on your door and wants to know if you can mow your lawn. If your lawn really needs to be mowed, you might choose to employ him for $10. If he charges $20, he might still not complain. But if he charges $50, $100, $1,000, at some point that job will not be created. Jimmy will be unemployed. Why is this? It isn't because you're greedy. It's simply because you value $100 more than that service being provided. In this case, your lawn being mowed. An employer has to believe that the value created by an employee is greater than his cost. And that is why minimum wage laws cause unemployment. It is impossible to sustain employing anyone doing work which is valued less than their wage. The higher the minimum wage, the sooner Jimmy is out of a job. Think about it. How many jobs would be lost if entrepreneurs were forced to only hire people whose labor they valued at $20 an hour? How about $50, $100 an hour? If the minimum wage is fundamentally sound, we should be able to increase it without fear of hurting the economy. Sure, some very highly skilled workers wouldn't be hurt by a $100 an hour minimum wage, but the rest of the workforce would be unemployed. When employment costs increase, entrepreneurs have two choices. They can reduce the amount of people they employ, or they can raise the price of the goods they produce. Otherwise, they're in the red. This makes the minimum wage a double whammy. Even if you don't lose your job, you and everyone else in the economy will be forced to pay for more expensive goods. Now that's counterproductive. And keep in mind, who is hurt most by rising prices? It's the lower wage workers, the very people the minimum wage is trying to help. In a free market, employment is a win-win-win situation. Employers benefit because the value created by their employees is greater than their cost. Workers benefit not only from a wage, but they also gain work experience, which they can use to demand higher wages in the future. And society as a whole benefits from that labor being added to the total pool of economic productivity. But the unemployment caused by the minimum wage is a lose-lose-lose. Workers are robbed of their wages and that invaluable work experience. Employers are robbed of the benefit that would have been gained by employing. And the whole economy is worse off because those unemployed workers are now unable to contribute their labor to help everyone's economic prosperity. To learn more about sound economics, visit fee.org.
Okay, so again, this is the standard economic critique of minimum wages. Just again, the way to summarize that is to say that you cannot pay people more than the value that they create for your business, otherwise you're losing money and your business will obviously shut down. The other standard argument, if you need to say it in one sentence, is, well, we want $15 minimum wage an hour to provide people the capacity to earn a decent living, but then why stop at 15? Why not simply ask 100? Or $1,000 an hour, then make everyone wealthy, and we will really take care. If we're serious about poverty, we should have $1,000 minimum wage. Well, why is no one asking for that? Okay, so again, the standard critique here is that this is all a matter of degree. $15 an hour will create some employment for people who don't create $15 of value for their employees. But it's the same effect than if you were having a minimum wage of $100 an hour. It's just that the impact when it's 15 will be lower or will be smaller than if it was 100. Anyway, it's never a popular subject with you guys at your age. I assume that a number of you have worked for a minimum wage in your life. But again, this is the standard argument. The other thing that will typically happen if you raise the minimum wage at a level that employers cannot afford is that a number of jobs will disappear. I know that many of you are used to going to McDonald's and punching your order, but you would only see that in Europe 10, 15 years ago because Europe had minimum wages that were higher than North America. And so it made sense for Europeans to develop those machines. In North America, wages were lower, so it made sense for employers to stick with a greater number of employees, but eventually the technology became well established over there. It's been crossing the Atlantic these last few years. And if you, again, raise the minimum wage law above the value that employees create, well, machines are more likely to replace people. Anyway, that's the standard economic argument, and I believe that there's a fair amount of truth in it. But if you have a question on that, I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to restate the standard economic argument, which you're free to disagree with. But if I ask you one perspective on one thing, I expect to see that perspective. But if you want to add a line, I don't believe any of that nonsense, that's okay. I'm not taking points off. Okay, so the institutions that are involved in labor markets, you've got the national governments, which typically set laws and standards on wages and working conditions. But you've got also regional jurisdictions, so Canadian provinces, American states, other regional units in other parts of the world, where often labor laws are determined. And there is often competition between various jurisdictions. Which is why, for example, you've got some American states where union power is stronger than others, and you've got other states that have implemented legislations that are known as right to work, which are really anti-union legislations. You also have local governments, you've got the unions and collective bargainings, you've got international organizations, but truth be told, they don't really do much. They might gather data, they might do advocacy, but the players that typically matter are still found within countries. The one exception being perhaps Europe, where the EU, the European Union bureaucracy has become increasingly important over time. Okay, 10 major unions of the Canadian Labour Congress. This is from your textbook. So some of the most important unions in this country are the Canadian Union of Public Employees, the National Union of Public and General Employees, the Public Service Alliance of Canada, the Confédération des syndicats nationaux in Quebec, the Canadian Teachers Federations, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and a few others. Now, those that I've listed are government employees, unions, and that's been the trend these last few years. So unions have become increasingly less relevant, or at least less important, in the private sector, but they have remained extremely significant in the public sector. So the Confédération des syndicats nationaux is typically the, it has been historically the government union in Quebec. The one exception, the one that does not belong to it, is the teachers union, which is a separate entity. Not that you need to know that, but the Confédération des syndicats nationaux came from a tradition of Catholic unions in Quebec. The bigger union, the one that deals with private sector worker, came from an American tradition. American unions moved at some point in time into Quebec. They unionized most of their workers in the private sector. The Catholic unions eventually became more prominent in the government. But I'm not going to quiz you on that. The point I want to make is that, again, the most important unions today are typically government workers' union. Now, some countries have higher unionization rates than others, but you can see the evolution over time. So Canada, for example, had a percentage of its workforce that was unionized 20 years ago that was nearly 33%. But today it's about a quarter. So it's gone down somewhat significantly. Denmark, 80% down to 68, Finland 79 down to 69, Japan 22 to 18, France 9 to 7.9, although this is kind of misleading, and that's because in France labor laws are very strict. You're kind of covered by the government at a level that you're not elsewhere. Germany from 29 to 18, Italy from 44 to 35. But you can see the trend here. So even Sweden, especially Sweden, the country basically went bankrupt in the 1990s and introduced a number of reforms, one of which was to curtail union power. Okay, so the authors then discuss labor market segmentation. The point they make is that in theory, we're all Canadians, we should be able to work wherever we want. This is one big country. This is true in some cases and not in others. So for example, if you're a Quebec construction worker and you wanted to move to Alberta during the oil boom, getting a construction job in Alberta is very easy. Let's say that you're an Alberta worker and for some reason, I don't know, you meet a Quebec girl, you want to move to Quebec and become a construction worker, good luck. The unions really control the market there. If you want a job, you've got to go through the unions. And they work very hard on the principle of seniority and baseball bats and other things, but that's another issue. Okay, the movement between some segments can be difficult. Seniority tends to restrict the geographic mobility of workers. So in a number of union settings, what determines your place in the pecking order is how long you've worked for a particular business. So this is obviously seniority. So people who have worked longer for a business are less likely to be laid off than people who have worked for a few years. And typically, I'm sorry if I tend to sound bitter about unions, but if you want to know my personal story, the first time I joined a union in Quebec, I was told, okay, you pay your dues, but we're not going to defend you, and if somebody is fired, it's got to be you. It's not going to be people with more seniority. And that has sort of tended to influence my view towards union. I was like, well, why am I paying you then? Because you don't have a choice. Okay. So the thing is that in some settings, then the fact that your seniority matters so much is, in a way, preventing you from trying to move on to something else or to try something else, because obviously you don't want to lose your seniority. So the rest is kind of bad dependency. We've discussed that concept before, but obviously the skills that you accumulate over time will make you valuable. And it might be that your skills are so valuable that you don't care about seniority because your skills are in high demand, and you'll always be able to find a job that is more to your liking. Okay, the authors then discuss dual labor markets, so primary and secondary labor segments. There are other ways to approach this, but there is a traditional distinction between white-collar and blue-collar working segments. So the white-collars are typically the managers. The blue-collars are people who do the dirty work or else work on the assembly line. White-collar jobs were typically less unionized than blue-collar jobs, but again, things have changed over time. The authors here describe as white-collar jobs as being stable. Well, if you were in middle management these last couple of decades, you might want to argue with them. Blue-collar jobs in large firms, anyway, that are unionized tend to be structured by collective bargaining, obviously. Okay. Now, there is a common perception that the more educated you are, the more valuable you will be. The argument that is being made is that, well, if you look at the median earnings of people with a doctoral degree or a professional degrees, they tend to be higher than some college with no degrees or some bachelor's degree. Well, this is true, but then you also need to consider what it is that people are doing. Do they have a job that is related to their training, or do people who tend to get a professional degree more motivated to begin with, and let's face it, a bit smarter perhaps than other people, and wouldn't they have gotten a better wage even without that training? These things are always open for debate, and there's a huge literature on that. But now it's time for a life lesson. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mike Rowe. Discovery Channel used to be the presenter of Dirty Jobs. So if you've never seen the show, it would do a number of disgusting jobs, so one a week or one or two a week. Did over 300 of them, and came up with some life lessons that I thought he should share with you. So again, hoping that this works.
Hey guys, Adam Hudson here. Have you ever dreamed about starting your own online business and building an income stream that comes in?
There are only two things I can tell you today that come with absolutely no agenda. The first is congratulations. The second is good luck. Everything else is what I like to call the dirty truth, which is just another way of saying it's my opinion. And in my opinion, you have all been given some terrible advice. And that advice is this: follow your passion. Every time I watch the Oscars, I cringe when some famous movie star, trophy in hand, starts to deconstruct the secret of their success. It's always the same thing. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't have what it takes, kid. And the ever popular, never give up on your dreams. Look, I understand the importance of persistence and the value of encouragement, but who tells a stranger to never give up on their dreams without even knowing what it is they're dreaming? I mean, how can Lady Gaga possibly know where your passion will lead you? Have these people never seen American Idol? Year after year, thousands of aspiring American Idols show up with great expectations, only to learn that they don't possess the skills they thought they did. What's really amazing, though, is not their lack of talent. The world's full of people who can't sing. It's their genuine shock at being rejected. The incredible realization that their passion and their ability had nothing to do with each other. Look, if we're talking about your hobby, by all means, let your passion lead you. But when it comes to making a living, it's easy to forget the dirty truth. Just because you're passionate about something doesn't mean you won't suck at it. And just because you've earned a degree in your chosen field, it doesn't mean you're going to find your dream job. Dream jobs are usually just that, dreams. But their imaginary existence just might keep you from exploring careers that offer a legitimate chance to perform meaningful work and develop a genuine passion for the job you already have. Because here's another dirty truth: your happiness on the job has very little to do with the work itself. On Dirty Jobs, I remember a very successful septic tank cleaner, a multimillionaire who told me the secret to his success. I looked around to see where everyone else was headed, he said, and then I went the opposite way. Then I got good at my work. Then I began to prosper, and then one day I realized I was passionate about other people's crap. I've heard that same basic story from welders, plumbers, carpenters, electricians, HVAC professionals, hundreds of other skilled tradesmen who followed opportunity, not passion, and prospered as a result. Consider the reality of the current job market. Right now, millions of people with degrees and diplomas are out there competing for a relatively narrow set of opportunities that polite society calls good careers. Now, meanwhile, employers are struggling to fill nearly 5.8 million jobs that nobody's trained to do. This is the skills gap. It's real, and its cause is actually very simple. When people follow their passion, they miss out on all kinds of opportunities they didn't even know existed. When I was 16, I wanted to follow in my grandfather's footsteps. He was a skilled tradesman, could build a house without a blueprint. That was my passion, and I followed it for years. I took all the shop classes at school. I did all I could to absorb the knowledge and skill that came so easily to my granddad. Unfortunately, the handy gene is recessive. It skipped right over me, and I struggled mightily to overcome my deficiencies, but I couldn't. I was one of those contestants on American Idol who believed his passion was enough to ensure his success. One day, I brought home a sconce I had made in wood shop. Looked like a paramecium. After a heavy sigh, my granddad gave me the best advice I've ever received. He told me, Mike, you can still be a tradesman, but only if you get yourself a different kind of toolbox. At the time, this felt contrary to everything I believed about the importance of passion and persistence and staying the course. But of course, he was right, because staying the course, that only makes sense if you're headed in a sensible direction. And while passion is way too important to be without, it is way too fickle to follow around. Which brings us to the final dirty truth. Never follow your passion, but always bring it with you. Congratulations again, and good luck. I'm Mike Rowe from MicroWorks for Prager University.
To subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Okay, so I don't know how many of you are planning to follow your passion. I did, and I still got a job, so in my case it doesn't quite apply. But based on what I know about life, based on what I know of the people I went to high school with, I believe that this is sound advice. So you make of that what you wish. The video is available online. There's something like an hour interview with that fellow where he expands on his ideas, but I think you should give that a little consideration. Okay. So labor bargains, labor markets. Now what happened in the last few years is that union rates, the rate of unionization in large private firms went down because a lot of these firms were no longer competitive. So for example, General Motors began to lay off workers because they could no longer compete with Japanese manufacturers a couple, 2 or 3 decades ago. And so when there's no work available, when you don't manufacture a product that people want to buy at the price at which you want to sell it, or at least at a price that allows you to make a profit, then obviously people lose their jobs, not just blue collars, but also white collars. And so what happened in many cases is that firms that became more important over time developed different types of approach to labor relations. So instead of having the very rigid type of union or collective agreements that large American car builders had, like General Motors, Toyota developed a different approach to managing its human resources. They developed job rotation, teamwork. They moved in American states where you did not have much of a union tradition. And for a while they prospered, and they really threatened American car manufacturers. But in time, those were bailed out. Japanese manufacturers had problems of their own. These things do change over time, but the bottom line is that management and workers ultimately are playing for the same team, even though there might be a lot of antagonism within a particular firm. So what the authors tell you happened is that labor markets became increasingly flexible over time. There was a lot more subcontracting done by large firms, and you came to have a group of core workers that firms would keep, people who were essential, but then you had peripheral workers who were typically hired or fired as needed. And this increased flexibility allowed firms to be more competitive. But again, the point is that no firm is an island, they're all competing with each other, and when either management screws up or unions make demands that are unrealistic, both management and workers will suffer as a result. Okay, another controversial issue, and you will notice that there are actually more videos today than usual, is sweatshops. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. That's because you were born in a world where, again, a lot of things were manufactured in China. For you, that was nothing new. But there have been, over time, various developments in the Chinese labor market that are of interest. So I have a couple of videos here that I want to show you, and I will, again, discuss the main points of these once I've played them.
So how does a garage startup become the most valuable company in the world? Well, Apple Computer did it by selling 93 million iPhones last year and 40 million iPads. And the only reason they didn't sell more is that they can't make them fast enough. But that relentless demand has raised uncomfortable questions about how these precious objects are made and how the people that make them are treated. A few weeks ago, the company invited me to witness its first ever third-party audit of its biggest Chinese supplier, Foxconn. For the record, our parent company Disney and Apple have strong ties. Our CEO sits on their board, and the Steve Jobs Trust is Disney's largest individual shareholder. But I only agreed to report exactly what I saw on this, the first look inside the iFactory. We arrive at dawn. Is this the entrance? No idea what to expect, but eager for a glimpse of the mysterious place that builds the stuff that fills our lives. We're met by a top Foxconn executive who refuses to confirm that inside all these buildings, they're working on top secret projects for Intel, Nintendo, Dell, and many others. There we go. But Apple has allowed him to show me how they build the world's most popular objects of desire. The ones that turn a little garage startup into a company more valuable than Exxon, a brand more beloved than any other.
I'm told this is the very first time any reporter from any country has been allowed to see this.
Yep. We will don static-proof jackets or full bunny suits and take numerous air showers because one speck of dust can ruin an entire line. There is one obvious reason for Apple's legendary secrecy over the years. If the world sees this line, it might change the way people think in this line. Unlike any other product, the launch of a sexy new Apple gadget is a cultural event. And that cult following comes in part from a mystique cultivated brilliantly by Steve Jobs.
It's really extraordinary, and I urge you to get your hands on one and see for yourself.
I'll admit, I'm among the millions who bought into the idea that these are not just dependable appliances, they are works of art. Carefully wrapped in pristine boxes, lovingly sold in museum-like stores. I don't know about you, but when I'm enjoying a delicious steak, knowing where it came from changes the experience. So how many steps are there?
Around 141.
141 steps.
Yeah.
But it is time now to think different about Apple. Because here it is. This is where your iPhone was born, and these are the people who brought it to life.
My name is Bill. Nice to meet you.
I'm first struck by how young they are. Not 13 like some of the horror stories I'd heard, but 17. 18. No one looked over 30. I know many came from poor villages out in the countryside with the hope of making $2 an hour. But their haircuts prove that teen style lives everywhere. I was expecting more automated assembly, more robots, but the sleek machines that dazzle and inspire and change the lives of people 8 to 80 are mostly made by hand, after hand, after hand.
Behold the camera module for the iPad. Look at how tiny and intricate this is. And get this, with 2 shifts, they can make 300,000 of these in a single day.
It takes around 5 days and 325 sets of hands to assemble an iPad, they tell me. And they can turn a raw hunk of aluminum into a sleek design, complete with the bitten Apple logo, at the rate of 10,000 an hour. At the end of this process, I find 27-year-old Xiao Ying, who carves the aluminum burrs from 3,000 apples every shift.
What are you thinking about while you're working?
A lot of times I think about how tired I am, the mother of 2 tells me. I think about resting. A supervisor will give the occasional order in Mandarin, but on this line, the machines do most of the talking, while the people work in silence. And they will repeat that motion and hear that fembot voice a few thousand times more before lunch. Their 12-hour shifts are broken up by 2 hour-long meal breaks when they march single file to a massive canteen and pay around 70 cents for a plate of meat and rice. If they eat fast enough, they can catch a few winks back at their spot on the line. The Foxconn executive tells me it's not exhaustion, but a Chinese post-meal tradition.
So this is home. How long have you guys worked here and lived here?
After 12 hours here, many head home to a nearby dorm room they share with 7 other workers. There is an internet cafe and a soccer field. They even offer classes in English and other studies. But most are here to work. Most left their families to work because back home, there are few good jobs.
Okay, so again, I suspect that many of you have no real desire to work for $2 an hour in 12-hour shifts, but you can see that there's no shortage of people who didn't have the luck that you have to be born in a country and with parents who gave you the opportunities you have, and for whom this is the best that they can hope for. Okay, follow up here.
The journey began 6 weeks ago.
Is this the entrance?
When we arrived at the Foxconn gates filled with fascination and dread.
Can you switch your mic on, please?
There we go.
It was an intriguing chance to witness the creation of the MacBook, the iPhone, and the iPad. The products that have fans sleeping on sidewalks in anticipation. Rushing stores to buy another model of a gadget they probably already own. A devotion that turned Steve Jobs' garage startup into a company more valuable than Exxon. But while Apple is among the most beloved brands in the world, we came expecting to find the kind of horror stories that have demonized Foxconn.
My name is Bill. Nice to meet you.
With over 1 million employees, Apple's top supplier also works for Intel, Nintendo, Dell, and many others. But while they build 40% of the world's electronics, relatively few Americans knew their name until 2010, when 9 Foxconn workers jumped to their deaths in a span of 3 months. The suicide nets are still a reminder of that horror.
An explosion hit a Foxconn plant in Chengdu.
And also fresh are the memories of 2 explosions last year, which killed 4 and injured 77.
Did it take something that severe to make you rethink how you treated your workers here?
I think absolutely.
While Apple's been doing internal audits since 2006, the drumbeat of bad press, even allegations of child labor, led to a new era of openness. They finally revealed the names of most of their suppliers and joined the Fair Labor Association.
Hello, I'm Bill Weir.
Hi, I'm Julia.
And we were there when the head of that watchdog group began an unprecedented investigation.
How do you know they're not putting on a show for you if they know you're coming?
I expect them to put on a show for us. That's normal. But over the next couple of days, everything will surface.
goes through your mind when you do the same thing all day like this?
While I met plenty of Foxconn workers willing to complain about long hours, low pay, bad cafeteria food,
You can be honest.
we knew there was only so much an American with a camera could uncover here. So we anxiously awaited the results of that audit, including the anonymous survey of over 35,000 workers on, get this, iPads. Good to see you again. Several weeks later, and just a few hours ago, the FLA posted their findings. As Americans understand the term, would you define Foxconn as a sweatshop?
No, it's a very modern facility.
Did you find any evidence of child labor?
We did not.
None.
No child labor, no forced labor.
So what are the most egregious violations being made there?
Overtime. Overtime.
With an insatiable demand for new gadgets over here, and a massive hunger for steady work over there, forced overtime is one of the most pervasive workers' rights problems in China. The law here says no one can work more than 49 hours a week, but no one actually obeys that law. Apple's official limit is 60 hours a week. So, 6 days a week, a Foxconn worker like Zhou Xiaoying will spend 10 hours a day filing Apple logos on the back of iPad cases 3,000 times a shift.
What are you thinking about while you're working?
A lot of times, I think about how tired I am, she tells me. They get 2-hour-long meal breaks when they march single file into a massive canteen and pay around 70 cents for a plate of meat and rice. If they eat fast enough, they can catch a few winks back at their spot on the line. So how does that happen for forced overtime? You think your shift is ending, the boss says, hold on, you're going to spend the night here?
Question is, are people doing it voluntarily? Do they have a say? If they refuse overtime, are they going to face any kind of a recrimination?
Everybody we talked to said they wish they made more money. I mean, that's a universal sentiment, I imagine.
Right.
But what about there? Is it fair what these folks are making?
They're paid about 20% above the minimum wage, the legal minimum wage. We asked them if they feel that it's fair, and the majority said yes, they felt it was fair. But they also felt it wasn't enough to meet their basic needs.
And here's the big headline. According to the FLA, Foxconn has agreed to sweeping changes. By July of next year, they promise that workers will only have to put in 49 hours a week while taking home the same amount of money as they do working 60 hours now. But in order to keep up with demand, that means Foxconn will have to build entire new lines and dorms and cafeterias and hire tens of thousands of new workers. Is Apple going to eat that cost? Is it going on to the customer?
Social responsibility has a cost. Obviously, Foxconn will absorb some, the buyers, because it's not just Apple, it's all of the other electronics companies as well, who have to absorb some of this. And I think we need to be ready to put our money where our mouths are.
Steve Jobs never visited his Chinese factories, but in a telling move, his replacement Tim Cook was at one yesterday. In a statement tonight, Apple said, "We appreciate the work the FLA has done to assess conditions at Foxconn, and we fully support their recommendations. Our team has been working for years to educate workers, improve conditions, and make Apple's supply chain a model for the industry." The company boasts that they have educated over 1 million assembly line workers of their rights. But other watchdog groups think they can do much better.
In 2006, it did a similar investigation with a group called Verite and found, mass-scale overtime violations and promised to clean it up. And it's now been 6 years and nothing has happened. So, I hope that they're serious this time.
How do you know they're going to do this?
There are two reasons I know they'll do this. One is that we will monitor it and verify it and report it publicly. But secondly, they've made this commitment publicly now. And you guys and the consumers and the external stakeholders are all going to watch to see if they actually deliver.
Okay, so again, working conditions that make your life look pretty decent, even if you put in a few all-nighters to study for your term test or your final exam. But a couple of things here. So over time, obviously, from the firm's perspective, it makes a lot more sense to have already skilled employees working longer hours than hiring, training new ones, and building a new line. They're under a lot of pressure to supply the market. I mean, when that was filmed in 2012, the iPad was still all the rage. So it's one thing to monitor and to ask for better conditions. Typically, the trade-off is between the fact that if you pay more and you offer better conditions, you can get better workers, so you can be more selective that way. But at the same time, there is a price for all of that, and are we as consumers willing to pay more so that these people can earn more money, or are we very human and are we always shopping for the best bargain? And in that context, how much can you improve the conditions of workers? But again, another fact that was mentioned in this video that perhaps could have been expanded a little bit on is that they offer workers opportunities to upgrade their skills. Many of them don't know how to use Excel, for example. Learning Excel is a valuable skill in a large organization. You can move off the line and move up management, for example. And acquiring more skills is obviously a way for you as a worker to improve your working conditions. Okay, but again, these issues are controversial and they're not about to disappear, because if at one point in time workers in China become too expensive, well, production will likely relocate to other countries where people are willing to work for $2 an hour and 60 hours a week, and perhaps more if there's a sudden surge in demand. So it's not just Foxconn, it's not just Apple, it's also workers in other locations that would like to have those jobs. And it's also workers in China, you saw the lineup, for whom when you come from a small rural village and don't have much of an education, these jobs, at least for a few years, give you the opportunity to build some capital and improve your life. And in a world full of choices that would not really appeal to any of you, something like this job might be the least bad available to them. So again, reality often comes in various shades of grays, and it's not just enough to say, well, they should be paid more. Yeah, but then maybe Samsung or somebody else that doesn't do that will come up with a product that is more affordable, and will consumers be willing to pay more? Okay, one last thing regarding this.
What can improved site performance do for your hotel website? Drive your business forward.
When you just get into the factory, we can see the chairs that have been changed.
Firstly, let me just contact this.
If you could ask, maybe we go over to the dorms now, but if you could ask if there's any way we can go, we just go to that one place. We don't need a factory tour, we just want to see her.
This is Keith Bradshaw reporting in Western China. Over the past year, the New York Times has focused on the globalization of production of electronic devices, including the sometimes grim labor conditions at factories making Apple iPhones, iPads, and laptop computers here. After publishing reports about harsh and sometimes unsafe environments, we began to hear about a response from Apple, as well as its contractors, and efforts to improve working and living conditions for employees. We also heard that Hewlett-Packard might already be following better practices that could be a model for others in the electronics industry. We decided to come check if there were any real changes. We began our trip in the city of Chongqing in southwestern China at two factories, a very new model factory run by a company called Quanta, and an older factory managed by a company called Foxconn, which has been in the news in the past year over harsh working conditions. Both factories are making computers exclusively for Hewlett-Packard.
And the question is, if Hewlett-Packard can manage to improve working conditions, can the rest of the industry also do so?
Companies like Apple and Hewlett-Packard don't own these factories. They contract with factory owners to have their products made. But as some of the largest customers in the world, they have significant influence over how the factories are run.
We're trying to change, and again, it is not perfect.
HP executive Tony Profit showed us around. There's one big change immediately evident. HP's new business model brings the factory to the workers. Traditionally, factories have been in big coastal cities like Shanghai or Shenzhen, and factory workers came from other parts of the country, usually inland and far away. HP's factory in Chongqing is different. They built where potential employees live, and the factory does employ many locals. This allows workers to go home and see their families more frequently.
I'm
a local from Chongqing. We have 2 days off each week. We can go home every weekend since our home is near.
Your mother must think you are a good daughter.
Yes, every time I come home, my mother is very happy.
I used to work in a different factory, and they let me work overtime, so I would make more money and have more savings.
So why did you move here?
Because my home is near here.
We visited assembly lines as well as recreational and dormitory facilities. The facilities for workers at Quanta looked like some American college campuses. Workers have access to free food, internet lounges, a martial arts gym, and even 2 karaoke bars. The dormitories also include venues like bookstores, a pharmacy, and a hair salon where a cut costs a little over $1.
You now have about 13,000 workers at the factory here, and they're expanding. They're preparing to have 40,000 workers here, all of them making computers for Hewlett-Packard.
Quanta and HB allowed us to spend roughly 8 hours walking anywhere and filming anything we wanted. They had warned us in advance that they might try to block us from filming, but in the end, we had full access.
Now we're traveling on the high-speed train from Chongqing to Chengdu, from the Hewlett-Packard operations to the Foxconn operations for Apple.
A fatal explosion took place there that the New York Times described in an earlier installment of the iEconomy series. One of the things we're going to try to do today is to follow up, to find out what changes Foxconn has made and what challenges lie ahead as Foxconn and Apple say they are trying to improve working conditions.
We're at the Foxconn factory now in Chengdu in western China. It has 160,000 workers, and its most famous product is the Apple iPad.
The Foxconn factory here did not allow us to come in, much less roam around freely. The 5 people we initially spoke to at Foxconn were pre-screened by the factory, and we had to interview them in a building just outside the factory gate. There we met Ms. Pugh, who told us that she has received 2 raises this year, and she has seen a change in corporate culture that began in February and March. Ms. Pugh told us about improved safety conditions, and she told us how the plastic stool on which she used to sit all day had been replaced with a chair with a very low back, and then with a second chair with a full height back that actually provided some support.
I used to sit with my back straight all the time. When there weren't many things to do, I could not lean back or rest. But now I can. Yes, there have been changes this year. There are lots of training programs aimed at improving workers' professional skills and work ethic.
Ms. Pugh then offered to show us her dormitory. 6 people live in a single dorm room. We noticed the balcony door and the window were both jammed wide open when we visited Ms. Pugh's room, and nobody had been able to push them closed.
You can't make 160,000 people happy all the time, perhaps even most of the time. But the question is whether you can treat them with a standard of decency that would meet an impartial outside observer's sense of what's right.
Despite our best efforts, the company would not let us into the factory even to see Ms. Pugh's new chair. So we left the factory and dorms and discreetly returned after nightfall to an area of eateries near the dorms. We wanted to meet people without being visibly shadowed by company minders and government security personnel. In the course of reporting this story, my colleagues and I spoke with more than 70 Foxconn employees, one at a time, in Chengdu over the course of a month, to get a sense of what has changed.
Foxconn is more humane than other companies in terms of company culture or the cafeteria and so on. It is more disciplined and stable. It doesn't matter if it is the annual leave or Lunar New Year, there is always welfare for the employees. As an ex-soldier and employee at Foxconn, Foxconn is just like home to me.
Yet many workers, particularly young men and women in their late teens who grew up as only children because of China's one-child policy, do not want to live under quasi-military discipline. Several workers told us of obscenity-laden harangues by factory foremen at Foxconn when they made mistakes or did not work quickly enough. 2 women told of a friend who had returned in tears to her dormitory and even briefly thought of suicide. They refused to go on camera. Such stories were the exception, however, not the rule. But they show that the Foxconn factory in Chengdu can still be a tough place to work at times. One of the biggest changes this year has been that these factories are limiting the number of hours people are allowed to work. That has reduced overtime pay. But the factories have been raising basic pay, so workers keep overall compensation roughly the same and have more free time.
The picture that emerges is one of a company that is making some changes, particularly material changes, but the corporate culture has changed much less. For the Apple iPads, are they being produced yet by workers under conditions that many Americans or Europeans would choose for themselves? Probably not. Are they being produced under conditions that are much better than those 10 years ago in China? Yes. And are, compared to a year ago, a little better, but it's still undergoing change.
With Apple and HP contractors employing hundreds of thousands of people across China, the changes that they carry out here could become an example for manufacturers across China. For the New York Times, this is Keith Bradsher in Western China.
Okay, so this was obviously a follow-up on the other thing, but as an economic geographer, the one issue I would like to draw your attention to is that the strategy in terms of locating factories of large corporations has changed in China in the last decade. It used to be that in order to be close to suppliers, they would locate on the coast where you could deliver parts from all over the world and assemble them in China. I mean, all the Chinese did at first was to assemble things that were manufactured in the United States, in Taiwan, in Japan, and Korea, put them together and ship them elsewhere. But as infrastructure has improved in China, and you can see that their trains are much better than via rail, it's become possible for those firms to move inland. Now, this being said, they do that for 2 reasons. You could say that they're doing that to get close to their workers, which is true. But as you've learned to, they're able to do that when you move inland, you actually pay your workers less. Typically, the more industrialized an area is, the more opportunities people have, the more wages tend to rise. But a pattern that you see historically, or at least in the last 2 centuries, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England to the United States and other advanced economies, the more a process becomes routinized, the more you can break it down in its various components, the more firms have an incentive to move out of cities where they were at first to more rural regions where they can get workers who have less options and who are willing to work for less money. So what is happening in China happened in the United States a century before, happened in the United Kingdom maybe a century and a half ago, but the pattern is fairly typical. Once process becomes routinized, they move from the more advanced part of a country to more rural ones. Okay, so you saw here that the operations that they were visiting were typically suppliers. So Foxconn is a large giant firm, but you don't really buy Foxconn product unless something happened that I've missed these last couple of years. What they do is supply components or provide assembly services for other corporations. And the reason why large firms began to subcontract was in many cases to acquire more flexibility. At some point, a business can become so large that managing human resources or resources, period, is too much of a headache. You can subcontract, you break down the work, you let other people solve problems at a certain level, but you remain the company that puts everything together at the end and distributes products to market. But flexibility has its advantages. And this is why we live in a world with many firms and many suppliers rather than living in a world with one large firm that manages everything. At some point, there are such things as these economies of scale, as we discussed earlier. Okay, so over time, work has become more flexible. You would work at General Motors a few decades ago. You knew exactly what you could do and what you could not do. Somebody needed, let's say, there was dust in some corner of a workstation. The employee could not clean it himself, well, because it was typically a man if he was working there. You needed to call in somebody else to do the work. But as organizations have become more nimble, as competition has increased, work contracts have become more flexible. Now, this is good and this is bad. People can acquire more skills and do more things, but at the same time, you can be asked to do more and more and have working conditions that are not as enjoyable as they perhaps might have been in the past. Okay, so again, some more concept and indicators. So working age population, you're a part of it, even though some of you might not have a part-time job at the moment. The number of people between ages 15 to 64, although I suspect the age will go up as people live longer and healthier lives. Workforce participation refers to the rates, the share of people employed in the working age population. So you might have a population of I don't know, I'll just make up numbers, 30 million people. Let's say that 25 million of these people are between age 15 and 64. How many of those people, how many of those 25 million people, how many of those people age 16 to 24 actually have a job? And this is not directly related to the unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate will tell you the number of people who are unemployed who are looking for a job. So the participation rates in some countries, you can have two countries, if I'm not losing you here, with unemployment rates of, let's say, 5%, but one country might have a workers' participation rate of 75%, another might have a country, might have a participation rate of 60%. Now, obviously, you can have two countries, same number of people, same population, same unemployment rate, but there are many more jobs in one of these economies than in the other. So unemployment, as you know, is a reality. I don't know, many of you are about to get out of this place. Probably not too many, since this is a second year course. But in a couple of years, maybe you will have to look for something to do with your life beyond college. And the reality of employment and unemployment will obviously hit you perhaps very hard. So it used to be the job market was very good in the late 1990s when I completed my degree. I knew that I would get something somewhere, perhaps not in academia, but I was never quite in doubt. The last few years, up until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I would tell your colleagues who were a bit depressed about job prospects, well, you know, why don't you move to Alberta? They're hiring left and right at the moment. This is not something I can tell you anymore. So employment and unemployment are cyclical. Some economies are doing better than others. And obviously, the people who tend to be the most unemployed are the people with the least job experience, which means you guys. So, comparative labor force statistics among 16 countries. You can compare typically a country like the United States, where the participation rate among female is about 61%, so that was a few years ago. In France, it's 56%, and the unemployment rate in the United States was 8%, and in France was 10%. So again, a lot more people have, a lot more women have jobs in the United States in the working age bracket than in France, and the unemployment rate is lower. So a lot more people actually earn an income proportionally in the United States than they do in France. So some labor market issues. Well, the GTA is still growing, jobs are still being created here. But a few years ago, Calgary had a much lower unemployment rate than Toronto, and today it has the highest unemployment rate in the country. So it's a combination of obviously low oil prices and other policy conditions, but these things do change. Now, the thing about people from Alberta, if you ever get to know them, is that they've learned to live with a cyclical commodity, which is oil. So they know that they will have it very good for a number of years, and then that times will be tough for a while. But instead of moving out, a lot of them just want to tough it out and wait for the good days to come back, or at least for oil prices to go up a little. So there are economies that are built around a commodity that will do very well, then will go bust, and the cycle will be good again. Then you've got more diversified economies like Toronto, which might chug along, perhaps not as spectacularly as Calgary, even though the economy has been very good, but you have much less pronounced economic cycle, or at least labor cycle, in a place like Toronto than in a place like Calgary. Okay, but what lesson can we learn from this? Well, typically that if you don't teach skills, if you don't promote entrepreneurship, if you don't promote job creation, you will have a problem. So I suspect at this point you're too young to remember the London riots of a few years ago, but for those of you who don't remember, which is I suspect the majority, a number of people your age really rampaged the city for a while, and then there was the big question, why? Is it all employment or is it something else? So another quick video here.
A semblance of normality returns to the streets of Britain after days of rioting and looting. Police have now arrested hundreds of those involved, and many will face time behind bars. Some experts, however, worry authorities may overlook potential underlying causes, from government spending cuts to a lack of jobs. Despite the public's demand for justice, they say a ferocious crackdown on the culprits is not the long-term answer.
There are now many more people waiting in the wings, so to speak. So even if you jail all of those who were on the streets yesterday, there are many more like them whom we've got to contend with, and we have to find a way of doing that constructively.
Given the age of many rioters, there's an increasing focus on youth unemployment. Approximately 1 million people aged between 16 and 24 are officially deemed out of work. At more than 20%, it's the highest figure since the mid-80s, doubling in the last 3 years alone. But some economists say the development does not just reflect broader difficulties in the UK economy.
Britain has a serious problem with a large group of disadvantaged young people who've been essentially failed by the educational system, not got any decent skills or qualifications, and hence have very few decent prospects in today's labour market. So they have very little in the way of opportunity. That's certainly one of the factors, by no means the only factor, but one of the factors behind this.
Elsewhere in Europe, jobless problems are even more acute. Youth unemployment in Spain is more than 44%, while Greece is not that far behind. The lack of jobs and severe austerity measures have already triggered serious unrest in these countries. It's prompted talk of a lost generation, but some are wary of drawing too many parallels with the UK, where the labour market is comparatively more robust.
Some of these continental European countries have reasonably well-functioning education systems that produce well-educated young people, but given the malfunctioning of their labour markets, those young people aren't able to find jobs. So it has similar manifestations, but the causes are rather different.
Earlier in the week, there were major disturbances in the East London district of Hackney. With calm now restored, locals at this market had a range of views on what's behind the bedlam. Limited job opportunities are a concern, but for many, it's not the only factor.
There's a lot of people that don't have jobs, obviously, and they need to do certain things to make money. That was just one of them. This is just one of them now, isn't it? But I wouldn't directly say it's linked to it, because some of them don't want jobs. So this was just them making their money. That's it.
It has become very volatile in terms of finding a job. You know, like me, if I was to go look for an IT job at the moment, I won't be able to get an IT job, even though I have 2.5 years working in the industry. You know, I won't be able to get that job because there's loads of people out there that has 20 years, 15, 10 years plus experience working in there. So what companies are doing is that they're taking, you know, the people with the experience, and they're the ones who get in the jobs at the moment.
Personally, I feel that at this age, they shouldn't even be worrying about job opportunities. You should be going to college or school, or university, or doing an apprenticeship.
Last November, thousands of young people marched in London against government plans to almost triple university fees. Many are nervous about entering a hugely competitive job market burdened with student debts totaling thousands of pounds. The protests triggered the country's worst violence of recent times until the mayhem of this week unfolded. Across the educational divide, it seems Britain's youth is united in its anger and fear about what the future holds. Set against a lacklustre economy and too few jobs, their mood of desperation is unlikely to lift anytime soon. Darcy Lampton, Reuters Insider.
So my goal here is not only to scare you, but to frighten you, but also to remind you that any line you can add on your CV is actually important. So if one of you wants to volunteer to be a note taker, that's something else you can add to your CV, and you could show a bit more enthusiasm, because when you hit the job market, trust me, you'll need all the lines that you can use. Okay, now the other thing though is that one economist was mentioning that there are two issues here. On the one end, there's the kind of skills that you learn at school or not. On the other, there is how flexible the labor market is, how creative people are people creating new businesses, are people in an economy that tolerate failures, that allow people to try new things and to create new jobs. And so what he was telling you is that in the UK, the education system kind of sucked compared to other European countries, but because their labor market is more flexible, because they're more welcoming of other businesses, because they make it less difficult to start a business, well, so far the youth unemployment rate, this is still true today, I believe, has been much less bad than in other European countries. So you heard figures like 44% in Greece and Spain. Okay, I'm gonna say something that's gonna get me in trouble again, but when you go to London at some point, that was true a few years ago, it seemed to me that everybody who was working at Starbucks was from Eastern Europe. And I talked to some employers, they say, well, we like Eastern European kids, they show up on time, they don't make a trouble, we don't want British kids. So at some point you also create your own opportunities. Now the problem though with creating job is that this is not obviously always easy to do, and there's always the temptation to say, well, we will force business to hire people, we will erect a wall to force business to repatriate jobs in the United States. But is this really the way to go? And there is a common misconception here that is addressed by an economist who has one of those videos. His name is Brian Kaplan. The one thing I will ask you to remember about his presentation is that the best social insurance is to make more progress, not to make more work, which is a counterintuitive notion that leads to a lot of fallacies in terms of, well, we can just hold on to the jobs we have, or we can bring back jobs that have left. Typically, these things have left for a reason. They're not likely to come back. And the only way forward is to create a new kind of work. So I'm almost done showing you videos, but trust me, that's more interesting than covering the content of the text.
Especially during a recession, we almost automatically think that anything that saves jobs is good, and anything that destroys jobs is bad. But what would our world look like if we took this idea seriously? 200 years ago, virtually everyone was a farmer. In those days, virtually everyone had to be a farmer just to feed the population. People often went hungry, nonetheless. Over time, though, people invented new and better ways to put food on the table. Better seeds, better plows, better fertilizer, better energy sources. A farmer with a tractor was able to produce far more food than a farmer with a horse. A horse has but 1 horsepower. As food production shot up, the fraction of people with farm jobs quickly fell. Would it have been a good idea to ban the tractor to save those jobs? In hindsight, the idea seems silly. If government held back progress, we'd still be hungry and we'd still be farmers. But when people are losing their jobs, we almost always see disaster. Humans suffer from what I call make-work bias, the tendency to judge economic performance not by production, but by employment. Time really is money, a lot of money. If a superfluous worker earns $30,000 a year to sit quietly at his desk, the world is roughly $30,000 poorer. Why? Because the worker could have been doing something productive instead. Doing something productive instead sounds awfully vague, especially if you just lost your job. But the last 2 centuries of progress show that this isn't just hand-waving. New ideas have totally changed our economy and our labor market. The result is the unbelievably advanced civilization we see all around us. Think about the jobs people around you were doing. How many of these jobs could you even explain to George Washington? If progress is hard to explain after it happens, it's nearly impossible to chart before it happens. When tractors are replacing horses, who is going to have the foresight to say, the unemployed will now go build an advanced industrial economy? How about the foresight to say, let's prepare the world for the internet's arrival a century from now? The main thing we really know about progress is that progress is coming, unless we stop it. Modern democracies rarely actually ban new technologies to save jobs. But many regulations inspired by make-work bias try to protect workers' jobs, even if the workers aren't producing much. Most European countries have intricate regulations that make it very costly to lay off or fire workers. In the United States, worker lawsuits serve a similar function. One big downside of laws that protect workers' jobs is that they make employers more reluctant to hire in the first place. You're less likely to give a worker a chance if you know you'll be stuck with them, even if he disappoints you. But there's an even deeper problem with laws protecting workers' jobs. Suppose the law had no unintended side effects. Everyone who wants a job for life gets a job for life. What happens when demand for a worker's skills dries up? What happens when new technology makes a job obsolete? A lot of workers will keep drawing a paycheck to produce little or nothing of value, and our whole society will be poorer as a result. It's tempting to say, it's a stagnant society, but at least it's a secure society. But it's not even that. In the long run, stagnation is deadly. When disasters hit, rich societies have the spare resources to cushion the blow. Rich societies have the flexibility to adapt. The best social insurance is to make more progress, not to make more work.
Okay, so we're almost done. Bear with me. So the global employment challenge, a lot of people have good intentions in terms of making sure that people are employed, or at least are not underemployed. But there's obviously no easy fix, because politicians have been, and activists have been promising or asking for that for decades. And if it was really so easy to create jobs for everybody, well, this would have been accomplished a long time ago. So as Kaplan was telling you there, the future is unknowable, but you know that if an economy stagnates and does not create new jobs that we cannot imagine today, then obviously the future will be bleak, and the future will belong to people who actually are willing to get up, learn some skill, and produce things that other people want to buy. The future will also belong to people who are willing to move. In your cases, you're reasonably lucky, at least in as much as if you don't want to move, you already live in Toronto, which is by far the most diverse and developed portion of Canada. So chances are that you'll find a decent job here if you want to. But if you don't, it's probably a good idea to pack your bag and acquire some skills elsewhere. There's nothing that prevents you from coming back at some point in the future if you want to. But migration, while it's never easy, is always more easily accomplished when you're young than before. You have family ties, and your network sorts of ties you in one particular place. I understand you want to stay close to your friends and family, especially, but if the economy is bad, it might be better for you in the long run to pack your bags and move. I mean, that's what I did. Renton, not far. I'm from somewhere northwest of Montreal, but you go where the jobs are and you acquire skills, and if I ever want to move back home now, I have a better chance to land a job than was the case when I first moved here. Okay, so as a result, a lot of people have been moving these last few decades, or you could stretch back to a few centuries. The main destinations are always the same, the US, Canada. Within countries, there's been a huge migration of people in China from the hinterland to the coastal cities when they were developing very fast, even though the government was against the idea. But again, there are some economic geography considerations that will always ensure that development is not spread evenly over a territory, but happens in typically a few places, which over time become large cities. Okay, decent work. Everybody wants decent work. Everybody wants better working conditions, better pay, shorter hours. In some cases, as in Foxconn, it happens. Perhaps because there was enough demand for the product that the price could be raised. perhaps because the workers were skilled enough that they had earned that anyway. But there are some strategies, like for example, asking for a minimum living wage, which might be extremely well-intentioned, but that might also have some unintended side effect. So it's never really pleasant to be told that, but again, you should understand that any economy is complex, and that it's not just having people who have money and people who have less money and spreading the wealth. You also need to create the wealth for an economy to be sustainable in the long run. Okay, so the authors conclude their chapter by saying that with globalization there is much pressure on the ability to unionize and on workers' rights. There's again no recipe for future success, but as far as you're concerned personally, the best way for you to deal with that is to improve your skills over time. Okay, so if you came in late, your assignment is here. I will post the last questions. I think I'll get up to 16, as I was telling you before, by tomorrow. And no surprises, don't overthink the answers. If they're straight from the textbook, they're straight from the textbook. If they're straight from the video, they're straight from the video. Okay, assignments, see you next week. Again, if you are not here at the beginning, you have to attend a function between 5 and 5:30. If you want to see me in my office hours, come to my office at 5:30, please. Or talk to me now.